It was the morning of August 9th, 1943. Across the United States, millions of Americans walked past newsstands and saw a face staring back at them from the cover of Time magazine. The face belonged to Major General Terry Allen. The headline hailed him as a conquering hero, the man whose tactical genius was sweeping the Axis forces out of Sicily. The article inside was a glowing tribute to a great division commander, a man destined for the highest echelons of military glory. But there was a cruel irony hiding behind that glossy cover. By the time the ink was dry and the magazines were being stacked on shelves in New York and Chicago, Terry Allen was already a ghost. 2 days earlier, in a dusty command tent in Sicily, he had not been promoted. He had been fired, was stripped of his command, humiliated, and sent packing on a transport ship back to America, labeled a discipline problem by his superior, Omar Bradley. Imagine standing on the deck of a ship, watching the coastline of the war zone fade away, knowing that while your country celebrates you as a savior, your career is effectively over. You are a hero to the public, but a failure to the army. This wasn't just a firing. It was a professional execution. But what Omar Bradley didn't know and what the German High Command would soon learn, in the most terrifying way possible, was that you cannot simply extinguish a man like Terry Allen. Bradley thought he was solving a problem. In reality, he was unleashing a force of nature that would return to Europe, not with a roar, but in silence, under the cover of darkness, to rewrite the rules of modern warfare. This is the story of the general who was too wild for the army, but exactly dangerous enough for the war. To understand why a war hero gets fired in the middle of a winning campaign, you have to understand the collision of two fundamentally different philosophies of war. The U.S. Army in World War II was not a monolith, it was a battlefield of ideas. And the two men at the center of this conflict represented the polar opposites of military thought. On one side you had Omar Bradley. Bradley was the GI's general, but he was also a creature of the system. A West Point graduate, he believed in the sanctity of the institution. To Bradley, an army was a machine. It required oiling, maintenance, and precise calibration. Discipline was the glue that held the machine together. If soldiers didn't salute properly, if their uniforms were unkempt, if they treated military police with disdain, then the machine was broken. Bradley believed that order on the parade ground translated to order on the battlefield. He was methodical, careful, and deeply suspicious of anything that smelled of chaos. On the other side was Terry Allen. Allen was a man who seemed to have walked out of a different century. He had failed out of West Point not once, but twice, struggling with severe dyslexia that the rigid academic system of the time couldn't accommodate. He didn't have the pedigree of the proper officers. He had entered the army through the back door, fighting his way up from the bottom. In World War I, he had led from the front, taking a bullet to the jaw and refusing evacuation because he didn't want to leave his men. Allen didn't see an army as a machine. He saw it as a pack of wolves. He didn't care about the polish of a boot or the angle of a salute. He cared about whether his men would follow him into hell, and more importantly, whether they could kill the enemy when they got there. He fostered an atmosphere of aggressive independence. His men loved him because he was one of them. He drank with them, cursed with them, and bled with them. But to a man like Bradley, Allen wasn't a leader. He was a liability. By 1943, these two philosophies were on a collision course. Allen was commanding the 1st Infantry Division, the legendary Big Red One. They were the most experienced American troops in the European theater, hardened by the brutal lessons of North Africa. But they were also wild. They had a reputation for looting wine shops, brawling in rear areas, and ignoring the terrified MPs who tried to reel them in. Bradley looked at the Big Red One and saw a mob. Allen looked at them and saw warriors. The tragedy was that both men were right, but in 1943, only one of them had the power to fire the other. The stage was set not just for a dismissal, but for a reckoning about what actually wins wars. The perfect salute or the perfect kill. Tension began in the deserts of North Africa. When American forces were humiliated at the Kasserine Pass, collapsing under the weight of a German panzer offensive, it was Terry Allen's 1st Division that stood firm. In panic and confusion, Allen's men held the line. They were the rock that stopped the landslide. But even then, The praise from headquarters was grudging. Bradley, then commanding the Second Corps, acknowledged Allen's tactical brilliance, but couldn't get past the aesthetics. He wrote reports detailing the outraged mayors and looted towns left in the wake of Allen's division. It was a friction that ground down their relationship day by day. Bradley wanted an army that looked like the brochures. Allen was giving him an army that looked like a pirate horde. But Allen had discovered something in Africa that was more valuable than clean uniforms: the cover of night. He realized early on that fighting the Germans in daylight was a suicide pact. The German Wehrmacht possessed superior optics, entrenched machine gun positions, and terrifying artillery coordination. To attack them under the sun was to walk into a meat grinder. So, Allen began to experiment. He pushed his men to operate when the sun went down. At Elgatar, he launched night assaults that caught the Germans completely off guard. The 10th Panzer Division, an elite unit, was forced to withdraw because they simply couldn't fight what they couldn't see. It was a revelation. Allen was rewriting the tactical manual, proving that an American infantryman with a compass and darkness was deadlier than a tank in daylight. Then came Sicily. In July 1943, the Allies launched the invasion of Sicily, a massive amphibious assault designed to crack Fortress Europe. General George Patton, who had a grudging respect for Allen's fighting spirit, specifically requested the Big Red One for the Gela landings, the most dangerous sector of the invasion. Patton knew that if anyone could hold that beachhead, it was Allen. He was right. Hours after landing, the Hermann Göring Division, a premier German armored unit counter, attacked with 90 tanks. They roared toward the beaches, intent on pushing the Americans back into the sea. It was a moment of absolute crisis. If the 1st Division broke, the invasion would falter. Allen's men didn't break. They fought with a savage intensity, using artillery, bazookas, and sheer stubbornness to halt the German armor. Bradley himself later admitted in a moment of rare candor that perhaps no other division in the U.S. Army could have repelled that charge. It was an admission that should have saved Allen's career. He had literally saved the beachhead. But for Bradley, success on the battlefield did not excuse insubordination in the rear. The breaking point came after the Battle of Troina. This was a week-long grinder, one of the bloodiest engagements of the entire campaign. Allen pushed his men relentlessly, cracking the German defensive line and opening the road to Messina. It was a victory, but it was an ugly, exhausting one. On August 7th, just as the smoke was clearing over Troina, the order came down. Allen was summoned to headquarters. He likely expected a commendation, or perhaps orders for the next advance. Instead, he was relieved of command. Bradley's reasoning was bureaucratic and cold. Allen had become too much of an individualist. He was being sent home because he couldn't, or wouldn't, force his battle-weary veterans to play by the rules of the parade ground. The shock was total. Allen's assistant commander, Theodore Roosevelt Jr., the son of a president, was fired alongside him. The men of the Big Red One were devastated. Weren't just losing a general, they were losing their protector, the man who understood the dirty reality of their war. Allen boarded that transport ship as a broken man. He had given everything to the army, and the army had chewed him up and spit him out because he didn't fit the mold. This moment in history forces us to ask a difficult question about military leadership. Bradley's decision to fire Allen is often cited as a necessary move to restore discipline. But when we look closer, it reveals a dangerous obsession with optics over outcomes. Bradley was a manager. Allen was a fighter. In a massive, industrialized war, you need managers to keep the supply lines moving and the corps coordinated. But at the tip of the spear, where the dying happens, you need fighters. Bradley's inability to tolerate Allen's individualism was a failure of imagination. He couldn't see that the very traits he hated, the swagger, the disregard for protocol, the fierce tribal loyalty, were the exact traits that made the 1st Division unbreakable. By firing Allen, Bradley sent a chilling message to the officer corps. Conformity is more important than victory. It was a decision that could have had disastrous consequences if the war hadn't been going in the Allies' favor. He removed a commander who had mastered the specific tactical puzzle of fighting the Germans' night attacks and replaced him with standard doctrine. It evokes a timeless tension in warfare, the friction between the garrison soldier and the combat soldier. The garrison soldier wants clean lines. The combat soldier knows that war is a messy, chaotic scramble for survival. Bradley was trying to impose geometry on a mudslide, but the story didn't end on that boat ride home. In Washington, there was one man who saw past the dirty uniforms and the missed salutes. George Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff, was the architect of the American war machine. Marshall was a pragmatist. He didn't care about the interpersonal drama between generals. He cared about winning. He had watched Allen's career, saw the reports from North Africa and Sicily. Where Bradley saw a discipline problem, Marshall saw a killer. He recognized that Allen possessed a rare gift, the ability to make men fight beyond their perceived limits. So, in October 1943, just 2 months after Bradley had discarded him, Marshall did something extraordinary, gave Terry Allen another division. It was the 104th Infantry Division, known as the Timberwolves. But this was not the big red one. These were not veterans, or draftees. Kids from Oregon and Washington who had never heard a shot fired in anger. They were green, anxious, and completely untested. Marshall was effectively handing Allen a lump of clay and telling him to mold it into a weapon. Allen took the assignment with a vengeance. He was no longer just fighting the Germans, he was fighting to restore his name. He took the lessons of North Africa specifically, the power of the night hand, made them the religion of the 104th Division. The training regimen he instituted was brutal and unprecedented. Standard Army doctrine called for maybe 8 to 10 hours of night training a week. Allen demanded sensu to sensu hours. The Timberwolves lived in the dark, slept during the day, and trained when the sun went down. They learned to navigate dense forests without flashlights. They learned to strip and reassemble their weapons by touch alone. They developed a complex system of clicks and hand squeezes to communicate without speaking. Allen stripped them of their natural human fear of the dark and replaced it with a predator's confidence. He taught them that the night was not a place to hide, but a place to hunt. When the 104th landed in France in August 1944, they were a different breed of soldier. They were night fighters. Their tests came quickly. In October, they were thrown into the campaign in the Netherlands and Germany. The terrain was a nightmare-flooded lowlands, dense forests, and the formidable fortifications of the Siegfried Line. Other divisions, flitting by the conventional book, were getting chewed up. They would attack at dawn, get pinned down by German artillery, and bleed for yards of ground. Allen unleashed the Timberwolves. They attacked when the Germans were sleeping. They infiltrated through the lines, bypassing strongpoints and appearing in the rear areas like ghosts. The 104th didn't charge into the machine guns. They slipped through the darkness, tossing grenades into firing slits and clearing trenches with bayonets before the enemy knew they were under attack. Town after town fell. Stolberg, Eschweiler, Inden. The Germans, exhausted and terrified, began to break. "We can't see you. You are everywhere." The psychological impact was devastating. German soldier was trained to fight a visible enemy. He was not trained to fight a shadow that slit his throat in the dark. What history books rarely discuss, what we must understand to truly appreciate Allen's genius, is the psychological toll of this kind of warfare. Night fighting is not just a tactical shift. It is a fundamental rewiring of the human brain. Evolution has hardwired humans to fear the dark. For thousands of years, darkness meant danger, meant predators we couldn't see. They had to walk into the pitch-black void, where every snapping twig could be a sniper, every shadow a tank hand. They had to do it with total aggression. Allen didn't just train them in tactics. He trained them in sensory dominance. You can't see your buddy to your left or right. You are alone. The mental discipline required to keep moving forward into that void is exponentially higher than attacking in daylight. But Allen flipped the script, taught his men that the darkness was their armor. Imagine being a German sentry on the Siegfried Line. You know the Americans are out there, you listen, you strain your eyes, but you hear nothing. Then, suddenly, a flare goes up, and you realize they are already inside your perimeter. Allen understood that fear was a weapon, and he wielded it better than any other American commander. He turned the battlefield into a horror movie, where he was the monster. The climax of the Timberwolves' journey was not a battle, but a discovery. They had crossed the Roe River in a spectacular night assault that shattered the German defenses. They were unstoppable. But on April 11, 1945, near the town of Nordhausen, The night fighters encountered a darkness that no amount of training could prepare them for. It was the moral abyss of the Nazi regime. The soldiers found 3,000 corpses rotting in the open air. They found hundreds of starving, skeletal survivors, slave laborers, who had been worked to death in the eternal night of the underground factories. For the men of the 104th who had spent months mastering the physical dark, this was a shattering blow. It was a stark reminder of what they had been fighting against. The night fighters had used darkness to liberate, but here they saw how the enemy had used darkness to destroy. They immediately shifted from warriors to caretakers. It was a somber, horrific end to their combat tour, but it crystallized the righteousness of their cause. Weeks later, on April 26th, the 104th reached the Muled River. There, they linked up with the Soviet Red Army. Allen's division had been in combat for 195 consecutive days. In that time, they had never yielded a foot of ground to a counterattack. They had never failed to take an objective. Reject General had outperformed nearly every elite unit in the European theater. The story of Terry Allen is more than just a revenge tale. It is a lesson in the complexity of competence. Omar Bradley, the man who fired him, went on to become the first chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He is remembered as the steady hand of the U.S. Army. But the man he discarded, Terry Allen, proved that sometimes the steady hand is not enough. Sometimes you need the wild card. Allen died in 1969, a legend to the men who served under him but largely forgotten by the broader public. Yet his legacy is woven into the DNA of modern special operations. The emphasis on night fighting, on small unit independence, on the psychological dominance of the battlefield, these are the hallmarks of modern warfare that Allen pioneered with a bunch of draftees in 1944. He proved that a leader's value isn't measured by how well he follows the rules, but by how well he rewrites them when the rules no longer work. Bradley wanted a general who fit the mold. Marshall wanted a general who won the war. In Terry Allen, he found a man who could do something far more difficult than marching in step. He could own the night. And in the end, while the polished generals were writing memoirs, Terry Allen's ghost was still out there in the dark, leading the way.